All right, hello everybody and welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. If you're not familiar with what we do here, we bring science, exploration, and conservation into classrooms around the world. We host around 30 to 50 live events a month, so definitely check back in to see if there's any others that you're interested in. So today is a very awesome event. We're being joined by paleontologist Dr. Matt Borths from the Duke Lemur Center, and he's going to tell us all about fossils and the amazing stories that they can tell us about what Earth might have looked like thousands of years ago. So welcome in, Matt, and I'll let you take it.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
All right, well, it's great to see everyone. It's the day after National Fossil Day, so thanks for extending your celebrations a little bit by coming to the collections at the Duke Lemur Center. So the Duke Lemur Center is a place in Durham, North Carolina, where we have a population of over 200 living lemurs, which are this group of animals. I'm going to switch around my camera so you can walk through this collection with me and see some of the stuff that I'm seeing. Lemurs are these animals. They live today on the island of Madagascar. These are maybe more familiar lemurs. And please check out tours from the Lemur Center of the past to see these animals as they're living in the forests of Durham. But where the animals are originally from is this island off the coast of Africa called Madagascar. And so the Duke Lemur Center is a place where researchers can study the behavior and the biology of these animals to try to learn more about how they work, how they live together, and a little bit more about what it means to be a lemur. But one question becomes, why do we want to learn more about lemurs at the Duke Lemur Center? Well, one reason that we're interested in lemurs is because of where they fit in the tree of life. So what this picture is showing you is a family tree that shows where lemurs fit in the family tree. This is a branch that shows the relationship between lemurs and other animals called primates. Primates are a group of animals that includes animals like lemurs, and it also includes animals like monkeys and apes. And if they include apes, that also means that they include us. Humans are part of this group of animals called primates, and lemurs are distant cousins of humans. And so one of the reasons we study lemurs at the Duke Lemur Center is because we're trying to figure out, what does it mean to be a primate? Because if something is true about lemurs and something is true about us and something is true about the animals in between, we can learn a little bit more about our own biology and our own story as a group of animals. So there's one way that we can study lemurs at the Duke Lemur Center. One is by actually looking at the living animals as they're going through the forests of Durham, North Carolina, or studying them out in the field in Madagascar. Another way that we can study the relationship between lemurs and other primates is by going into the fossil record. And so I am speaking to you from the fossil collection at the Duke Lemur Center, where we go deep into geological time. Geological time is divided into big chunks that have really big fancy names. So you may have heard of something called the Mesozoic, which is the age of reptiles. That's the time when non-avian dinosaurs were the big animals living on land. But then about 66 million years ago, the non-avian dinosaurs, animals like Tyrannosaurus rex and Triceratops, go extinct. And then we get into the Cenozoic, which is the age of mammals. And the age of mammals is what we're living in right now. So it begins 66 million years ago, and that is when our story begins. That is when we start to find the earliest relatives of primates, the earliest relatives of lemurs, and the earliest relatives of humans. And so in the fossil collection, we have fossils that kind of fill in this gap over the course of 66 million years of Earth history. And so part of the reason we study all of that is because we want to study these big transitions as we go from branch to branch in the primate family tree, watching lemurs take off and become really diverse and really specialized animals, watching as monkeys become diverse in South America and in Africa, and then finally when apes take off and lead to organisms that will eventually be very closely related to us. Now that all gets kind of complicated because we're dealing with really, really big chunks of time and lots of different animals. And understanding our role in all of that is really important. But another reason we study this is because as all of that is taking place over the course of millions and millions of years, not only are the animals living on the planet changing, but the planet itself is changing. So this is a picture of what the Earth looked like near the end of the age of dinosaurs. The continents are in slightly different places than you would expect today. So South America is a little bit closer to Africa. Africa is actually cut off from the rest of the world. It's basically a giant island. Places like Europe are really just a bunch of islands. Asia and North America is cut by a big ocean that kind of goes right through the middle of the continent. And so places that are today like Kansas, Nebraska, parts of Alberta, those are all covered in ocean. And we have North America kind of split into two different continents. Then as we get into the age of mammals, the world map starts to change and become a little bit more modern. As all of those changes are taking place, not only are the animals changing, but so is the environment that they're living in. One of the reasons why it's really important to study fossils is because the world is still changing. Today, we talk a lot about what's going on in the world, especially when it comes to climate change. That might be a term that comes up a lot in your household or at school. And climate change is simply the idea that the weather and the climate and the ecosystems that we see around us are not constant, and that there are things that cause them to change. Now, it can be a little hard to figure out exactly what those changes are going to look like because the world's a big, complicated place with lots of different organisms and lots of different things going on. And so one of the things we can do with the fossil record is we can look into the past to try to figure out if there were times when the world had conditions that looked a little bit like the ones that we see today to help us make predictions about what the future will look like. So I want to introduce you to some fossils that have been really important for helping figure out what the world looked like in the past and help us figure out a little bit more about the world, what the world is going to look like in the future. So this is a picture of a group of animals called Nathartus. So that's what the name looks like, Nathartus. Nathartus looks very much like a lemur-like primate. And that's because we think that they're closely related to lemurs. Now, lemurs today, if you wanted to go and see them in the wild, you would have to go all the way to the island of Madagascar. But if you could travel back 50 million years, you could travel to places like North America to find these lemur-like primates. We have a field project in the western part of the United States. So here's a map of the United States. Here's North Carolina, which is where I'm speaking to you from right now. And this is the state of Wyoming. And those red dots show where we go fossil hunting in Wyoming today. What Wyoming looks like today is a very dry, very open place in this part of Wyoming that we study. These are often called badlands because there's so little water that it's really not great land. But what it's great for is for finding fossils. And when we go into these rocks in the badlands of Wyoming, what we find are the remains of animals that were living not in a dry, open environment with very little water. Instead, we find animals like Nathartus, which lived in forests. We find big leaf trees that would have been really dense, this kind of jungle that you see in the background, a jungle that would have been in the western part of North America. So I'm going to show you some of the fossils of these jungle living lemur-like primates that lived in the western part of North America not that long ago. So this is the skeleton of a Nathartus. It's one of the most complete skeletons that's ever been discovered. It's in 3 different chunks. And so when we look at the skeleton, we'll start at the head. Right here is the skull of Nathartus. And so its eye would have been right here. These are its teeth. Here's its chin, its nose, and its brain would have been back here in this part of the brain case. One of the ways that we know that Nathartus is a primate is there's this connection that goes all the way through this loop around the eyeball. That loop that goes all the way around the eyeball is something that all lemurs and all monkeys and all apes have. And so having kind of bone that goes all the way around your eye is something that tells us we found a primate when this was excavated in the desert of Wyoming. This was found about 3 years ago, but the fossil would have been deposited about 50 million years ago. So it's a 50 million year old fossil. And we're very lucky because it was preserved with most of its skeleton. So these right here are the shoulder blades. This is part of the lower arm. Then connected to the top half of the body, we have the backbone. And so this is part of the ribs, the backbone going down to the hips. This right here is the hip socket, and the tail curving backwards here. And then connected to that hip socket would have been the legs. And the legs are right here. This is the femur, which is your upper thigh bone, and the tibia, which is your shin bone. Having all of that together in one skeleton tells us that we have a long-legged primate that would have been really, really good at jumping from tree to tree. But we also have part of its feet and part of its hands that tell us this is an animal that loved to live in the trees. Today, in the part of Wyoming where we find these fossils, there are not very many trees. But 50 million years ago, we know that there would have been a jungle in that place. And so one really important question is, why was there a jungle in Wyoming 50 million years ago? And today, it's a big badland where I have to be sure to bring lots and lots of water with me, because if we get stuck, if our truck gets stuck out in the backwoods, or we don't have enough gas, or we blow a tire, it can get really dangerous really quickly because we might not have enough water. Like, it's really not a good place to have people for a very long time. And it's not a great place to have a jungle for a very long time. One of the things that geologists, which are a group of scientists who study rocks, who work very closely with paleontologists, one of the things that they've discovered is that during this time, 50 million years ago, the world was much warmer than it is today. So not only were there jungles all the way up into North America, but there were jungles that kind of went all the way down far into the south. Even places like Antarctica had animals living on it. The ice sheets had not fully covered the southern part of the world or the northern part of the world. There were crocodiles and alligators that were able to live in the very northern parts of the world. And so all of that evidence tells us that the climate was very different. And so when we study what chemicals are trapped in rocks from this time period, it tells us that the world was much warmer than it is today. One of the things that's really interesting is that people who study how climate change works have looked at what modern climate maps look like what the future is going to look like if climate trends continue on the trajectory that they're on. And it looks like the Eocene, this greenhouse period when there was this kind of explosion of life all over the place and no ice caps, looks a lot like what our future might look like if we don't do anything to help keep the climate where it is today. The climate changed very quickly, and a lot of animals didn't really make it through that really hot time period. So that's something we can use from the fossil record to understand what's going on in the modern world. So with that, I want to take a break and ask if you guys have any questions about what I've talked about so far before I go to the island of Madagascar and show you a little bit about what we can learn about the modern world by studying the fossils of Madagascar.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So we'll do a round of one question for each of our camera spots. All right, Ms. Hoffman's class, do you have any questions?
Anyone? Logan?
Why was it so different now, back then than it is now?
Why was the climate different?
Yeah.
So one hypothesis for why it was so different is that because the continents were in different places, it meant that the way that ocean circulation works is really different. So one of the things that really drives climate change and climate in a general way is how water moves around the planet. Because cold water moving to warmer places create different changes for the way that clouds get formed and where rain ultimately happens. And so one thing we know is that Antarctica during the Eocene was not all the way under the planet yet. It was kind of starting to get down there. And a couple million years after this time period, Antarctica finally gets all the way under the world. And what happens then is you get ocean currents that start to go all the way around the bottom of Antarctica in the southern hemisphere. And those cold waters kind of get trapped. And that creates this giant air conditioner unit that causes this really dramatic change it basically dries out the world, because suddenly all of these ice caps start forming in Antarctica. That brings moisture out of the air, that causes things to become more dry. And that time period is when a lot of grasslands formed across a lot of the non-tropical parts of the world. And so we have fossils from that time period when Antarctica was kind of going into deep freeze. And that brings us to some of these fossils. Sorry, I'm going to try to flip my camera around again. So that time period is really interesting because that time period gives us some of the earliest monkey relatives. And so this is an animal called Egyptopithecus, which is an animal from Egypt. And Egyptopithecus is alive at this time when the world has started to become more like the modern climate we have today because the ice caps are forming. One of the reasons that we use this time period to understand what the future might look like is right now we're losing a lot of ice from the northern glaciers and the southern glaciers. And so we're putting a lot of moisture back up into the atmosphere. And so that's one reason why the climate was so different, is there was so much less water then trapped in ice than there is today. But our future might kind of go back to a time that looks a lot more like that. Another difference is there were a lot of changes going on as mountains started to pop up. So parts of Africa and parts of India and Asia, especially the Himalayan mountains, start to rise up in Asia. That causes a lot of rain to kind of get blocked as it's moving across the northern continents. And again, where rain patterns are has a major effect on climate. And so those changes are things that we see today. We don't have mountains rising up, but we are changing the way the surface of the land is used. And that has a big effect on the way climate ultimately is changing, because really climate is driven by the amount of moisture in the atmosphere and the average temperatures that we find in the oceans.
All right, super cool stuff. So I will bring in Miss Gartshore's class now. Do you guys have a question?
Yeah. My question is, what do you do when you find the bones?
When we find the bones, we first have to get them out of the ground. And so the easiest way to do that is where we're working in Wyoming, even though, like I said, there's not a whole lot of, it can be kind of a desert-like place when we're out there. Sometimes we can get really pop-up thunderstorms that can be really bad. And if you start to excavate the fossils when you're in the field, it means that the fossils can get ruined. And so what we do when we go out into the field is I work with a team of people who are all equipped with different tools, including this tool, which is called a rock hammer. And a rock hammer is really similar to just a regular hammer. But what we use that for is for going into the rock and removing big chunks of it. So what we do is we walk along the surface and we look for things that look like fossils. And so here is the side of a brain case of a primate. When we first found this bone was a little bit darker, and now it's been covered in glue to help keep it safe. And it kind of stood out like a sore thumb because this is really dark color against this really light rock. And so as soon as we found it, we looked around to see if there were other fossils poking out of the rock around it. We found the limits of where this fossil was, and then used our hammers to chunk the whole rock out to kind of get it out of the ground. We wrapped it up in toilet paper, and we wrapped it up in tape, and we wrapped it up in plaster so that we could bring it back to the lab, where a special researcher called a fossil preparator is able to then take those rocks and very carefully remove the rock from around them. And so last week, Carrie Whitman, who is our fossil preparator here at the Lemur Center, showed how she does her work, where she goes into the rock and actually removes most of the rock from the surface. So you can see this is the fossil arm bone of one of these lemur-like primates that used to live in Wyoming. And this is the face of this animal. It's an animal called Smilodectes. And Smilodectes is this little primate. Its eyeballs would have been here and here. It has a big brain and a long nose. And once Carrie gets the rock off of the fossil and gets it prepared in this really beautiful way, stabilizing it with glue. Then it goes into the collection so that researchers can study it and learn about how its body was put together, how it moved around, what kind of food it ate. So all of these cabinets that you see here are all specimen cabinets. If you've ever been to a museum before, you might have seen that there are exhibits at the museum that kind of walk you through the history of life, or they walk you through the history of art, or they walk you through the history of your community. Behind the scenes, the museum usually has what's called a collection. And in the collection, there are more things than they can ever put on display, because most museums don't have enough room to put everything on display. So all the things back in the collection all get a number. And it's like a giant library of science where researchers can come and check out specimens from our collection. And so after we find them and prepare them, then the fossil becomes part of the collection, and then the research can start to take place. And so all of these cabinets behind me are full of specimens that all have numbers, and all of them have been involved in some kind of research as people, for instance, interested in how animals move around might be interested in these backbones. Or people interested in what the climate used to be like can actually take samples from these specimens, grind them up, and look at the chemicals inside of them to reconstruct the diets of the animals and the environment that they might have lived in. So that's kind of the end of the life cycle of the fossils in our collection, is when they finally make it into the drawers, and then the real research can get started, and they can be used in lots of different ways. That's what we end up doing with fossils at the end of the day.
All right, that sounds like a super interesting process. So I will now bring in Ms. Cazzola's class, and do you guys have a question?
So how many bones would be in their body?
One more time.
How many bones would be in their whole body?
How many bones are in the whole body? It depends on the kind of animal. Different animals have different number of bones in their bodies. So for humans, we say that there's about 106, but there's some bones that people count in different ways because the way that bones actually condense and ossify, which is the process of becoming bone, can be a little bit different. In humans, we have one big jaw bone down here and 3 little bones inside of our ear. If we were lizards or we were reptiles, we might have a lot more bones because they have more bones in their jaw. And they have more bones kind of in their lower body. They have more backbones often, they have more ribs. So different animals have different numbers of bones. And it's a good question that I don't know the answer to know the most bones that are in an animal. But if we're looking for a human, we're looking for more than 200 bones if we found the whole thing. And it's true of most primates, but I will do a little bit of research to figure out what animal has the most bones, because that's a really good question.
All right, awesome. I will bring in Miss Parra's class now. Do you guys have a question?
Which is the smallest primate bone you have?
The smallest primate bone we have actually is probably behind me right now. Let me see where it is. So right here on these shelves, we're working on, I'll just do it this way. On these shelves, we're working on cataloging all of the bones that we have in our collection that aren't from fossils, but these are from animals that were living much more recently. So these animals are all part of our, they used to be part of the living collection at the Lemur Center. And so at the Lemur Center, all the animals live to a healthy old age and die of natural causes. But then afterwards, we can learn a lot about their biology if we study their bones. And so we keep those bones here. And so one of our smallest animals that we have in the collection, looking for where we put, we're reorganizing things because we're working on opening up a new exhibit. So I'm going to show you this animal. This is an animal called a dwarf lemur. And so a dwarf lemur, as its name implies, is it's small. So it's a little bit bigger than a rat. And we also have animals that live at the Lemur Center called mouse lemurs. And mouse lemurs are the smallest primates that are alive today. And mouse lemurs are in their name because they're the size of mice. They're like yay big, and they're very cute. And so those are the smallest bones we have in the collection. Oh, here we go. one sec. I'm going to sit you down for a sec so I can open this box. This is the skeleton of a mouse lemur. And so this is my thumb for scale. So a mouse lemur is really small. It's like the size of a rodent instead of a primate. So those are probably the smallest primates that we have in our collection. And they're not extinct yet, but they are very endangered.
All right, interesting. We should all do our part to support the mouse lemur then.
Yeah.
Now I will bring in Miss Idris's class. Do you guys have a question?
Let me ask. No, I think they don't.
Where are most fossils found?
Okay, yes. Can you hear him? Can you say that?
Yes. Where are most fossils found? That is a really fascinating question, because fossils in general can be found all over the world. One of the things that we have in this part of our museum, I lost how to rotate myself around, but these are called geological maps. All these colors represent different time periods because the surface of our planet is covered in different aged rocks. Those rocks pop up over time as plates slam into each other because continents move across the surface of the planet very, very slowly. As that happens, volcanoes and mountains get built up and they erode away, and river systems flow through them and shallow oceans go across them. And so all these colors represent different ages of rock, which means we can find different ages of fossils and different kinds of fossils in many of these places across the globe. And so this is a picture of North America. This is kind of the middle of the continent. This is the east coast of North America, and so I'm speaking to you from down here. And this is the west coast. So you see lots of different colors here. So it really depends on what kind of fossils you want to find that tell you where to go in the world. And so different places have different numbers of fossils that are useful for different kinds of questions. So I am originally from this part of the world, which is the state of Ohio. And in that part of the world, in the southwestern corner of Ohio, is a really important chunk of rock that is way older than the dinosaurs. It's from a time period called the Ordovician. And the Ordovician was a time when Ohio was covered in reefs. And reefs are big, complicated ecosystems that are in shallow oceans. And you can see on this chunk of rock that there are lots of shells that are on here. These shells are called brachiopods. Other animals that lived during this time period were things like squids and things like trilobites. And all these little animals that would have been living, and some big animals, living at the bottom of the ocean. Basically, when they got covered, sometimes during big hurricane events or flooding events that, lots of sand or silt gets moved all at once, they would get buried. And so in the rocks where I grew up in the southern part of Ohio, it is just fossils. Like the rocks themselves are full of fossils. And so you can't help but find fossils because that's just what the rocks are made out of. So there's some places that are like that. There's other places where fossils are much rarer. Usually the most dense fossils are places that used to be in a shallow ocean where you find these reefs. And so something I recommend if you want to do some fossil hunting in your area to figure out what kinds of fossils you have under your feet is contact your closest natural history museum or contact your closest university geology department. And they can point you to some resources for how to collect fossils or how to collect rocks in your area. And they can tell you where some of the most fossils are closest to you. And so that's a really important part of doing fossil hunting is knowing where you are right now and how old the rocks are under your feet.
All right, super cool stuff. We'll take a question from Mr. Black's class now, if you guys have one.
Howdy, you want to come up? Yep, one sec.
Did you ever find a T-Rex bone?
You know what? I personally have not found a T-Rex bone. I have gone to the age of rocks where a T-Rex is preserved, and I didn't find T-Rex because we didn't spend very much time there, but I did find a Triceratops bone. There was a brow horn of a Triceratops that was just kind of this big cone that was like eroding from the side of the rock, and it was one of the most incredible things that I've ever seen was a Triceratops horn just laying there in the rock. The reason that we were there is because the research that we were doing was about what happened right after the extinction of the dinosaurs. So T-Rex and Triceratops were alive right at the very end of the age of dinosaurs. And so we were walking through that area and we found the Triceratops because we were going to the rocks just above where the dinosaurs were, where the non-avian dinosaurs go extinct, and we can actually find the dust from the asteroid impact that helped to drive the end of the final end of the dinosaurs. And we then look at the rocks just above that, because that's when the earliest Cenozoic begins. And my research really focuses on what happens after the dinosaurs go extinct and what ecosystems develop when those animals go extinct. And so we walked through the area. There might have been some T-Rex under our feet, but then we went to look for the mammals that survived the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. But it was very exciting to be walking through the area where there was T-Rex and Triceratops.
All right, awesome questions, guys. Matt, I'll let you get into Madagascar now, and then we'll have time for another round of questions after.
Wonderful. So the next part of kind of looking at changes in the fossil record and what fossils can tell us about the modern world comes from Madagascar, where there are fossil expeditions going on trying to study what happened in Madagascar in the very recent past. Because one of the things that we know about Madagascar is that, sorry, I'm trying to turn my camera around again. I'll just do it this way. Was that Madagascar today has lots of small lemurs that were the size of things like cats and dogs, that are the size of like cats and maybe small-sized dogs. But in the recent past of Madagascar, there were giant lemurs. And so this animal right here is an animal called Megalatopus. And Megalatopus means the giant lemur. And so the giant lemur is a creature that would have been on the island of Madagascar, and we think only went extinct maybe 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago is a long time, but also 1,000 years ago, the Roman Empire had already fallen, and human history is really going. These animals are alive at a time when humans would have been kind of creating civilizations across much of the world. And why these giant lemurs, things like the giant Megalatopus, which would have looked something like this. This is a picture created by Carrie Whitman, who's our fossil preparator. Megalatopus is sometimes called the koala lemur because it has these long front legs and short back legs, and we think it would have moved a lot like a koala when it was in the trees. It's hanging out with one of its, another animal that would have lived in the same ecosystems called Paleopropithecus. Paleopropithecus is sometimes called the sloth lemur, and that's because it lives under branches, just like a giant sloth. These animals went extinct very recently, and we want to figure out why that happened. Now, there are some fossil sites in Madagascar where we can study the recent past of the island. And so this is a map of the island of Madagascar. And one of the fossil sites where people from the Lemur Center have gone to study fossils is way up here in the northern part of Madagascar. And when they went to these fossil sites in northern Madagascar, they found some of these giant animals that we find in the rocks of the things like Megalatopus and Paleopropithecus. But one of the other things that they found was lots and lots of specimens of an animal called Lemur Simus. And so Lemur Simus is this animal here. And so this is the skull of one of these Lemur Simus animals. Lemur Simus is the scientific name for this creature, but there's a common name for it. And a common name is what people who aren't using Latin to talk about animals call them. And this animal is called the greater bamboo lemur. So even though we find the bones of Lemur Simus in the fossil record of Madagascar, we also know that there's still Lemur Simus alive today. And it's called the greater bamboo lemur. It looks like this, and you can see it actually eating bamboo. One of the things that we know about the greater bamboo lemur is that it is a very, very, very endangered animal. In fact, it was thought to be extinct for a little while in the 20th century until it was rediscovered by a team of researchers that included people who had trained at the Lemur Center, who went on the hunt for the greater bamboo lemur to see if it was still alive. What they discovered is that the greater bamboo lemur lives down here in the eastern part of Madagascar in very, very small isolated pockets. But the subfossils that were found of this animal were all the way up here. There are no greater bamboo lemurs that live in the northern part of Madagascar today. But only a couple of centuries ago, we know that they were there. And so that tells us that in the very recent past, this very, very endangered animal was much more diverse, and it was living in places that are very different from the ecosystems that it lives in today. If we just had the modern record of the greater bamboo lemur, we would think that the greater bamboo lemur is a very, very specialized animal that can only live in a few little patches of the forest of eastern Madagascar, where it's probably going to go extinct anyway, just because its environment is so restricted and it's so specialized. But what we learn from studying the fossil record is actually this animal is much more diverse and much more capable of living in bigger, wider swaths of the island of Madagascar than we get credit for. And so that is really, really exciting when it comes to thinking about how we can conserve this very endangered animal. Instead of thinking of it as this like dead end that is probably not going to survive for very much longer because it's too specialized and things are changing too quickly. In the very recent past, it was able to live in some really amazing places across the island. And so hopefully we can use that information to help conserve habitats where the greater bamboo lemur could be in the future, as well as places it lives today. And I want to show you this. This is one of my favorite specimens in our entire collection. This is the skull of a greater bamboo lemur. We call it the crystal skull because it's covered in crystals and it actually sparkles in the light. Let me see if I can get a little bit of sparkle going on. This animal, or this specimen, is a little bit different than the ones I was just showing you because it's covered in crystals of calcite. And calcite crystals mostly form in caves. And that's where we find these specimens, are in the caves of northern Madagascar. And so what we can do is we can remove that rock. People like Carrie, our fossil preparator, can remove the rock and eventually get the skull to look something like this. So this is kind of the bone of the greater bamboo lemur specimen that was found in a very similar site to where the crystal skull was found. Because we have so many specimens of the greater bamboo lemur, we actually are probably going to leave this specimen covered in rock, both because it tells us a lot about how this animal was preserved. We can learn a lot about the environment this animal lived in by studying crystals that formed around this skull. And then we'll study, if we need to study the bone of Prolemur simus, we can use some of the other specimens we have in our collection. But the crystal skull is part of this larger story that tells us a very endangered animal would kind of seem like a lost cause if we only had the modern record. But because we have the fossil record, it gives us a little bit of hope that preserving these animals is possible because there are other places in Madagascar where it might be able to live very successfully. And so I'm going to introduce you to a few of the other animals that lived alongside the greater bamboo lemur when it lived all the way up in the north, and things like Megalopithecus, because Madagascar had a whole diversity of animals that live there today. There are lots of species of lemur. There are species of tenrec, which are kind of hedgehog and shrew, almost rodent-like animals that are most diverse in Madagascar. There's chameleons that live only in Madagascar. And in the subfossil record, we know there were other animals that lived alongside the giant lemurs, things like a giant eagle. And so this is a talon of a giant eagle that lived on the island of Madagascar. And so these talons would have been covered in a sheath that would have made it even longer. And so even though I keep talking about how the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct 66 million years ago and kind of left open lots of space for mammals to diversify, there are still dinosaurs that are alive today because there's a surviving group of dinosaurs that we call birds. Birds are living dinosaurs. And so that means there were dinosaurs living in Madagascar, and there were giant eagle dinosaurs that were living alongside giant lemurs. And these might have been predators that went after animals like this giant lemur called archaeolemur, which means the ancient lemur. And archaeolemur is sometimes called the monkey lemur because it has these big buck teeth in the front of its face, and it has big flat teeth in the back of its face. And the combination of big teeth in the front and flat teeth in the back tell us this is an animal that was really good at eating lots of different kinds of hard food. It's an animal that was adapted to living in lots of different environments and probably ate really dense fibrous food that would have been found on the ground. And it's a lemur that probably spent more time on the ground than in the trees trying to get food. When it was on the ground, it would have met other animals that also lived on the ground, like the animal that laid this giant egg. This is the egg of the elephant bird. The elephant bird is an animal that lived on the island of Madagascar and only went extinct, we think, in the last couple of 100 years. This is the egg of a chicken next to the egg of the elephant bird. The elephant bird egg can contain about 2 gallons of yolk. This is the largest bird egg that was ever laid because the elephant bird is one of the largest birds that ever walked the planet. And so because this is a bird egg, that also means this is a dinosaur egg. And it's one of the largest dinosaur eggs that has ever been discovered. And because it's an egg, eggs actually only represent one cell. So when you're looking at a chicken egg, this chicken egg is just one cell of a chicken. And so this giant elephant bird egg is one of the largest cells that has ever been discovered on the planet. It's an animal that would have lived alongside ancient lemurs on the island of Madagascar. And it only went extinct a few centuries ago. And so it's a really important animal for helping us to figure out what the ancient ecosystem might have looked like. Because we know that elephant birds were probably plant eaters. They were animals that would have eaten things like grass, and they would have eaten things like fruit. And as we look at modern ecosystems in Madagascar, the animals that are mostly filling the ecological niche that the elephant bird filled is usually animals that were brought there by humans, things like livestock, cows, goats. Those kinds of animals are probably helping the plants of Madagascar get around the continent by exploiting a lot of the same plant-eating behaviors that once were filled by the giant elephant bird. And so that means when we think about conservation in Madagascar, because we know the elephant bird used to be part of ecosystems, we know that big plant-eating animals should be part of Malagasy ecosystems. And so it means that when we work with people in Madagascar to try to conserve land and space for lemurs, we also need to think about how humans and their animals can be really useful actually for helping to keep ecosystems alive. And that connection between the importance of humans and big animals and plant eaters is only possible because we know about the fossil record of Madagascar. So does anyone have any questions now as we wrap up the session?
All right, so we'll start with Ms. Hoffman's class. Do you guys have a question?
Oops. You guys can ask some of your questions that you've been asking about. Go ahead, Madison.
What is the biggest fossil you have?
The biggest fossil we have is probably, let's see, it's not the biggest fossil, but it is from the biggest animal we have. So this is part of the skull of an elephant. And so this is just the very back part of the skull of this elephant. And so it's basically like the ear part. So like we're looking at kind of like this part of the elephant's skull. So the whole skull would have probably been like up to my waist. So it would have been like it's a really big elephant. It would have been like a 2.5 foot, 3 foot tall elephant skull. And so we only have some fragments of it because it's really hard to transport these animal remains because they're really big. So that's probably the largest animal in our collections. We have lots of elephants because we also have lots of elephant teeth that preserve much better than their skulls do. So this is the tooth of a woolly mammoth. That tooth is, here's my hand for scale. So it's just one tooth of this big elephant that used to live all across the northern part of the world. And we also have the teeth of some of its relatives. We have things like, this is a gomphothere, which is a mastodon. So mastodons are distant cousins of elephants that lived all over the world. They came from Africa, got into Europe and then Asia, then North America, and made it all the way down into South America. And so those are some of the fossils of some of the biggest animals that we have in our collection.
All right, sorry guys, but I think we're going to move on to another class now because we have pretty limited time. All right, Miss Idris's class, you had a question?
Yes, I'm just going to unmute my mic. Just give me a sec. Go ahead, Mahati. Go ahead.
How can you tell the times with fossils and the modern world?
Can I get that one more time? I'm sorry, it broke up for a second.
Like, how can you tell the olden times with fossils and the modern world?
So we can use fossils to figure out how old they are by studying the rocks that they're preserved inside of. So the rocks actually are made up of lots of tiny little things you might have heard of called atoms. And over time, atoms can change sometimes. And as those atoms change, we can predict how often they change. And as atoms change, we can then use those changes to figure out how old the rocks are. And so we don't use the fossils to figure out how old the material is, but we do use the rocks that are around the fossils to figure out how old they are. The exception to that is when we have really, really young fossils. So for instance, this eagle that I was showing you, here's the claws of that eagle, is from a site, from a site in southwestern Madagascar that has some very, very young fossils. And they're so young that this isn't really rock. Instead, this is basically bone. And so we can sample the bone and use the atoms inside it that are called carbon. And carbon changes really quickly and can tell us how old some of these things are. And so there are fossils from this site that are only about 300 years old. And so we can figure out how old fossils are by dating them if they're really young. And if they're older, then we use the rocks to figure out how old they are by studying their chemistry. So paleontologists get to hang out with geochemists and geologists a lot to try to figure out how old the rocks are that we study.
All right, awesome. I'll bring Ms. Gartshaw's class in for another question.
Okay. How did dinosaurs go extinct? And when did you guys find the fossils? What year is what we're asking. What year did you guys find the fossils? What was the first fossil ever discovered?
So the first fossil that was found that's in the collection behind me was discovered, so the fossil collection at the Lemur Center got started in 1977. So it's been a really long time that people have been collecting fossils for the Duke Lemur Center. So every year since 1977, except for in 2020, when we weren't able to go in the field to collect fossils, there have been teams that have been going out from the Duke Lemur Center to go and collect new fossils. And so we have fossils that were collected. This specimen that I was showing you from Wyoming that Carrie's working on, this specimen called Smilodectes. This skull we actually discovered in July of 2019. So we found this last summer, and it's already emerged from the rock like this. So that's how long we've been looking for fossils. It's like for decades. I've only been looking for fossils. Well, I've been looking for fossils for a lot of my life because I started out collecting fossils near my hometown when I was in elementary school. But then I really started collecting fossils for museums in college when I started working with researchers who are paleontologists at the university that I was at. And that's when and where I decided that I would become a paleontologist. I didn't know that I would want to be a scientist, let alone a paleontologist, until I was in university and I actually met people who studied fossils and found out that there was lots of cool research going on. Because I thought everyone had found all the fossils. It turns out that there are still like literally tons of fossils to be discovered. And there are so many questions that we have to ask. And that's part of what's so exciting about National Fossil Day, is that every year we get to tell people about all the new discoveries that have happened in the last year. And there's still more coming out all the time. So if you're interested in fossils, know that we're not done studying these things yet. And there's still new animals in the ground yet to be discovered.
All right, awesome. We will take a question from Miss Cazzola's class now. Do you guys have a question?
What was the coolest fossil you've ever found? Or like, the coolest fossil?
The coolest fossil I've ever found. The coolest fossil, honestly, the coolest fossil is that Smilodectes that I keep showing you. It is really exciting because working at the Duke Lemur Center, we're really interested in the evolution of primates, and we're interested in finding fossils of primates. Now, we don't just go into the field and only collect the primates. For example, we have the elephant bird egg, we have this eagle, we have elephants that are in the rocks, but when we go out, the thing that gets us really, really, really excited is when we find a piece of the story of lemurs as they move from North America into Africa and eventually down to Madagascar. And so discovering a skeleton of a lemur-like primate last year was one of the coolest and most exciting things I've ever done in the field, because I went out thinking we would maybe find a couple of teeth of primates. It'd be really exciting to find some horse material and some fish material. Those get me really excited too. I had no expectations of finding a primate, let alone a skeleton of a primate. But we have most of the skeleton of Smilodectes. And so being on the team that helped to find that was one of the most exciting things. And that only happened last year.
All right, super cool. So Miss Para's class, do you guys have a question?
Why do lemurs only live in Madagascar?
That is a really fascinating and important question. And to be honest, we are still working on why. We know that lemurs start their story in the northern continents because the oldest primate and lemur-like fossils are found in places like North America and in Europe and in Asia. Then they get down into Africa. And so we find the remains of lemur-like primates alongside the earliest monkey-like primates in Egypt. And so these fossils down here include animals like this animal called Afra-Adipus. Afra-Adipus is an animal that we think was closely related to animals that would become lemurs. And so this is kind of a scrappy jaw, but it tells us a lot about what this animal looked like and what it would have eaten. And it's related to animals like lemurs. The problem is that then lemurs get to the island of Madagascar, and that happens, we think, sometime between about 60 million years ago and 20 million years ago. So that's a big gap, and the reason why it's so big is because we don't have a lot of fossils from the island of Madagascar from that time period. We have lots of fossils from the more recent past, from like the Ice Age up to the present, but we don't have super old fossils from Madagascar. And so for some reason, the lemurs get from Africa to Madagascar. The way we think they did that was by crossing the ocean between Africa and Madagascar on what are called natural rafts. Every now and then, forests growing along the coast of Africa will break off. And sometimes those forests will have animals living in them. And as those forests drift across the ocean, some of those made it to Madagascar and had the relatives of lemurs. Now, in Africa, we find close relatives of lemurs, things like they're called galagos or bush babies and lorises. And so lorises and galagos, genetically we know, are the closest relatives of lemurs. But galagos and lorises in Africa and in parts of Southeast Asia are not as diverse as lemurs are. In Madagascar, lemurs really took off. And so why lemurs ultimately became extinct, mostly, they went extinct in North America, Asia, and Europe, why they mostly went extinct in Africa, and why they flourished in Madagascar is one of the big projects that we're working on in the fossil collection at the Duke Lemur Center.
All right.
And you can help us figure out that question too, because we're not going to be done.
For sure. Super fascinating question that some of our students might want to explore. So last but not least, I'll bring in Mr. Black's class for a question.
How many fossils do you have?
So in the collection behind me, we have about 35,000 fossils. And this is actually a pretty small collection because we're so focused on just the story of primates. It means that we're pretty selective about where we go fossil hunting and what we bring back. There are other fossil collections around the world that are huge. So even the closest natural history museum to you might have a very large collection. There are collections in New York and in Toronto and in Chicago that have millions of specimens. And so we know a lot about the past because of those important museum collections, but also because of these small collections like the one that I'm in. So we have 35,000 specimens, and we're working on getting more and more every year when it's safe to go back out into the field.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us here today and teaching us all about the fascinating relatives and ancestors of the lemur. So I will give a goodbye to all of our other classes now. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you so much for learning with me.